The village of St. Mary Mead was, by all appearances, a place of utter tranquility. The hedgerows were neatly trimmed, the cottage gardens flourished with light summer blooms, and life moved along with predictable ease, or at least it usually did. But on this particular evening, something disturbing unsettled the peace. At exactly 20 minutes past 9, the sound of footsteps was heard along the gravel path behind Fernla Cottage, a modest home on the edge of the village, where Miss Elspeth McGillicuddy lived alone with her Persian cat, Percival. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching over the path before stopping entirely. Down dashed silence. Miss McGillicuddy, who had been settling into bed, felt a chill crawl up her spine. She was a sensible woman, not given to fancy, and yet something felt wrong. She listened, waiting. Nothing. Just as she was about to dismiss it as a figment of imagination, she heard something else. Sudden, sharp cry, cut short, as if stifled mid-breath. A prickle of fear ran down her arms. She hesitated only a moment before snatching her dressing gown from the chair, hurrying toward the rear door of her cottage. She unlocked it with trembling fingers, peering out into the shadowed garden beyond. There was no one there. The air was still, the garden undisturbed, and yet the footsteps had been real, and the cry had been real, too. Miss McGillicuddy's fingers clutched the doorframe as her eyes adjusted to the dark. She strained her ears, hoping to hear the sound of someone retreating into the night. Nothing but the most unsettling thing was this. There were no footprints in the soft earth beneath the trellis, nor on the damp grass near the gate. The footsteps had come and gone, and yet there was no sign of them at all. By morning, Miss McGillicuddy's story had already spread across St. Mary Mead like wildfire. The idea of phantom footsteps and a muffled cry in the night was precisely the sort of intriguing gossip that set the village tongues wagging. Mrs. Larkin's general store. The matter was already being hotly debated over the weighing of potatoes and the purchasing of bread. Well, you ask me, said Mrs. Hubbard, adjusting her spectacles. It was nothing more than that dreadful boy, Timothy Briggs, up to mischief again. But what about the cry? Asked Miss Porter, clutching a basket of eggs. Miss McGillicuddy isn't one to imagine things. It could have been a fox, offered Mr. Sims, the grocer, as he carefully arranged a display of tinned peaches. Foxes don't wear boots, sniffed Mrs. Kirby. We had lived in the village long enough to know better than to dismiss odd occurrences so easily. At that very moment, the bell above the door jangled, and all eyes turned toward Inspector Harold Fletcher, one of the newer additions to the local police force. The inspector, a tall man with a steady demeanor, removed his hat as he stepped inside. I suppose you've all heard about the business at Fernla Cottage, he said dryly. Mrs. Hubbard crossed her arms. Well, you can't expect a story like that to stay quiet for long, Inspector. No, said Fletcher with a sigh. I suppose not. From the back of the store, Miss Marple, who had, until now, been examining a particularly fine spool of embroidery thread, turned and gave the inspector a pleasant smile. Oh dear, she said mildly. I do hope you're not here, just to ease our minds, Inspector. Fletcher hesitated. What do you mean, Miss Marple? She tilted her head. Only that there is a certain atmosphere in the air, attention, if you will. A general sense that something worse has happened. A murmur ran through the shop. Fletcher sighed, running a hand over his face. Well, he said, you may as well hear it now. A pause. Then, a man was found dead early this morning, not far from Miss McGillicuddy's cottage. He was Mr. Josiah Weatherby, the postmaster, who had made the grim discovery. He had been walking his usual morning route, delivering letters along the high street, when he had noticed something unusual in the small wooded grove behind Fernla Cottage. A body slumped against the base of an old elm tree. The man was unknown to him, dressed in dark clothing, and very much dead by the time Inspector Fletcher arrived at the scene. The body had already drawn a small crowd of onlookers, all whispering in hushed tones. Miss Marple, arriving a moment later, observed the scene quietly from just beyond the crowd. The victim's face was unfamiliar, his hands rough as though used to hard work. There was no obvious wound, no sign of a struggle, and yet he was most certainly dead. And then there was the most curious thing of all. The ground surrounding the body was damp and soft from the previous evening's rain, and yet, just like at Miss McGillicuddy's cottage, there were no footprints. Miss Marple, though appearing composed as ever, felt a small flicker of unease. Murder in St. Mary Mead was rare, and murder that left no traces even rarer. As she watched the police take notes, gather evidence, and move the body, she could already see the way the case would unfold. The police would search for a practical answer: a suspect, a crime of passion, an act of desperation. But Miss Marple knew better. This was not a random crime. It was something far more deliberate, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was already preparing their alibi. By midday, the murder in St. Mary Mead had become the only topic of conversation. The discovery of the unidentified man's body in the wooded grove had left the village uneasy, though no one would openly admit it. Instead, they did what villagers always did in times of uncertainty. They speculated at the Red Lion, the local public house. Small groups of men huddled over pints of ale, muttering about strangers, robberies, and secret feuds. At Mrs. Larkin's general store, the women of the village discussed the matter in low, urgent voices while pretending to examine rows of flour and biscuits. And at the church tea room, where Miss Marple sat quietly, stirring her tea, the more formally inclined villagers exchanged pointed remarks about the state of the world, the decline of moral standards, and the shocking boldness of committing a crime so close to their very homes. It was there that Miss Marple found herself drawn into conversation with Mrs. Kirby, Miss Porter, and the ever-talkative Mrs. Hubbard, three of St. Mary Mead's most enthusiastic purveyors of information. "You must admit, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Hubbard, adjusting her hat, "it's all very strange." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "Oh, indeed, Mrs. Hubbard." Miss Porter, who had been dying to interject, leaned forward. "Till to such a peculiar murder, too. No wound, no blood, no footprints. Why, it's almost as if the killer was a ghost." "Mrs. Kirby scoffed. "Don't be absurd, Miss Porter. There are no such things as ghosts." "Well," Miss Porter huffed, "you can't deny it's all very odd." "Oh, very odd indeed," Miss Marple murmured. She sipped her tea. It was always useful to listen to what people said when they thought they knew more than they did. And at that very moment, the door to the tea room swung open, admitting none other than Inspector Fletcher. The conversation halted immediately as all eyes turned to him. He sighed. "I see the whole village is already playing detective." Miss Marple smiled. "Inspector, one doesn't need to play when one is merely curious." Inspector Fletcher sighed again, rubbing his temples. "I may as well tell you now before you all filled the village with wild rumors. The man has been identified." Collective intake of breath. Miss Porter clutched her teacup. "Well, who was he?" Fletcher took a seat across from Miss Marple, looking wary. "His name was Michael Wetherall." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "That name is familiar." Fletcher nodded. "He was a land surveyor, not a local, but he's been seen in the village recently." "A land surveyor." Mrs. Hubbard frowned. "What would a man like that be doing here?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Perhaps someone hired him." Fletcher sighed. "That's what we're trying to determine. But here's the thing." He hesitated. "There was nothing stolen from his body. No money missing. No sign of struggle." Miss Marple waited. "The coroner believes he was poisoned." A hushed silence fell over the tea room. "Poison," It was a word that carried weight in a village like St. Mary Mead. Murdered by poison was not an act of rage or impulse. It was something planned, something intended, something personal, and it changed everything. Miss Marple set down her teaspoon, eyes twinkling with quiet understanding. Poison is a rather intimate method, wouldn't you say, Inspector? Fletcher gave her a long look. That's exactly what concerns me. Double quotes. Mrs. Kirby shivered slightly. It's quite chilling to think about, isn't it? A silent death with the victim never realizing until it's too late. Miss Marple nodded absently, already deep in thought. Poison required knowledge. It required careful administration, and perhaps most importantly, it required access. Who, then, had known Michael Wetherall well enough to either invite him close or tamper with something he consumed? A simple robbery gone wrong would have been a straightforward crime. But this was something far more intricate, and Miss Marple had the unshakable sense that she had already encountered a crucial clue, even if she had yet to fully recognize it. Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple walked home through the village, she replayed every detail in her mind. She could sense the police were already leaning toward the obvious suspects, whoever had last seen Wetherall alive, whoever stood to benefit from his death. And yet, she was not convinced. The lack of footprints still nagged at her. How could a killer leave no trace of their approach? Or, as she now considered, was the lack of footprints itself a clue? It was then, as she passed by Fernley Cottage, that she noticed something. Miss McGillicuddy was sitting on her garden bench. Looking rather troubled, Miss Marple hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the low wooden gate. "My dear Miss McGillicuddy," she said kindly, "you look rather troubled." Miss McGillicuddy sighed. "Miss Marple, I just can't stop thinking about last night. The footsteps, the cry, it all seemed so real. But then when I looked," she shook her head, "no footprints." Miss Marple took a seat beside her, watching as a light breeze rustled the garden leaves. "You are certain you heard them?" Miss McGillicuddy nodded firmly. "Oh yes." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Me, and you say the cry sounded as if it were cut short?" "Yes." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Then she asked, very gently, "My dear, do you recall if it sounded like a man or a woman?" Miss McGillicuddy frowned. Well, I assumed." She paused. A sudden look of realization crossed her face. "Oh," she breathed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I rather thought so." Just like that, she had taken her first step toward the truth. The following morning, St. Mary Mead was brimming with unease. The murder of Michael Wetherall, a man barely known to the village, was unsettling enough, but the manner of his death, the absence of footprints, and the eerie cry in the night had turned what might have been a simple crime into something altogether stranger. Miss Marple had spent the evening reflecting on her conversation with Miss McGillicuddy. Something about the way she had described the cry had sparked a thought not yet fully formed, but persistent nonetheless. And so, after finishing her morning tea and toast, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag, tied a neat bow on her hat, and made her way to the wooded grove where Wetherall had been found. The police had cordoned off the area, but with Inspector Fletcher's reluctant approval, she was permitted to observe, not interfere, of course, just observe. But, as Miss Marple well knew, observation was everything. The wooded grove behind Fernley Cottage was small but dense, its trees twisted and gnarled with age, their leaves already tinged with the first hints of autumn gold. The ground was still damp from the previous night's rain, the air fresh with the scent of earth and pine. Inspector Fletcher stood beside a constable, gesturing toward a section of undergrowth. "This is where we found him," he said. "No footprints leading in or out." Miss Marple, standing a few feet away, watched with mild interest as a young officer knelt down to inspect the soil. No signs of disturbance. The officer muttered. Someone walked here. They left no trace. Miss Marple smiled politely. Oh, how clever. Fletcher turned to her with a bemused look. You find something amusing, Miss Marple? Dear me, no, she said, adjusting the lace cuffs of her gloves. Only, I do find it curious that one might assume a person must have walked here at all. The constable frowned. Do you mean? Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. Well, dear, if there are no footprints, then perhaps the answer is not that the footprints disappeared, but that the killer never walked on the ground to begin with. Fletcher's expression shifted slightly, as though trying to keep up with where her mind was already headed, but Miss Marple had already turned her attention to something else, something small but peculiar. It was a leaf, barely larger than her palm, caught on the edge of a broken twig. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, but Miss Marple was not one to overlook the unremarkable. She bent down carefully, retrieving the leaf between her fingers. The others watched her in silence, but Miss Marple seemed unconcerned. She studied the underside of the leaf, then turned it over, and there on its surface was something quite unexpected, a fine dusting of powder. Fletcher frowned. What is it? Miss Marple handed it to him with delicate care. Perhaps you might have your clever man examine this, she said. I do believe it might be of some interest. Fletcher studied the leaf, then turned to his constable. Take this to the station. Have it analyzed. The constable nodded and hurried away. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts ticking away in quiet satisfaction, because she now knew two very important things. Michael Wetherall had not been alone in that grove, and whoever had been with him had brought something there, something fine, powdery, and altogether out of place. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the Red Lion, not because she had a taste for ale, but because she knew that if there was any place in St. Mary Mead where a man like Wetherall might have been seen, it would be there. She entered the pub quietly. Her arrival met with a few curious glances. Mr. Thomas Biddle, a publican, was wiping down the bar, his round face flushed from the warmth of the hearth. Miss Marple, he greeted, raising a brow. Now, this is a surprise. She smiled sweetly, stepping closer. Oh, Mr. Biddle, I do hope I'm not intruding. I just thought I might have a little chat with you. Biddle's brows lifted slightly. A chat. Miss Marple leaned in conspiratorially. You see, dear, I find myself ever so curious about this poor Mr. Wetherall. I was wondering if perhaps he had been in here recently. Biddle hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he set down his rag. As a matter of fact, he was, he admitted. Came in a few nights ago. Didn't stay long, just enough to have a drink and ask a few questions. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Questions? Biddle nodded. About the old mill outside the village. Miss Marple stilled. The old mill. Biddle shrugged. That's right. Abandoned for years, but he seemed mighty interested in it. Miss Marple considered this. A man comes to St. Mary, Meadowland Surveyor. No less, and starts asking about an abandoned mill, and shortly after, he is found dead. That, Miss Marple thought, was not a coincidence. As she made her way back home, Miss Marple felt the case beginning to take shape. The lack of footprints, the powdery residue, and now an interest in a long-forgotten place. It was all connected. She had no doubt of that now. And yet, one question remained unanswered. Who had Wetherall been meeting in the woods that night? 'Cause Miss Marple now felt quite certain of one thing. Michael Wetherall had not gone there alone. He had met someone, and that someone had killed him. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon quietly knitting by the window of her cozy sitting room. The rhythmic motion of the needles keeping her hands occupied while her mind worked through the puzzle at hand. The case was forming a pattern. Not yet one she could see in its entirety. She had gathered several important details. Michael Wetherall was a land surveyor. Not a local, but he had come to St. Mary Mead on business. He had been asking about the old mill, a place long abandoned, and of little concern to most. He had been murdered without any sign of struggle, likely poisoned, and, most curious of all, there had been no footprints leading to or away from his body, an impossibility, given the damp ground. And then there was the strange, powdery residue found on the leaf near his body. Miss Marple had no doubt that it would soon be analyzed by the police, but she already had a strong suspicion as to what it might be. Her instincts told her that this was not a crime of passion, nor an act of desperation. This was something planned, deliberate, and concealed with care. And yet, as Miss Marple well knew, even the most careful criminals made mistakes. Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by the distant sound of shouting from the direction of High Street. Frowning, she set aside her knitting and rose from her chair. Stepping outside, she was not surprised to see a small crowd gathered near the police station. Murmuring in hushed but excited tones, she made her way through the group with her usual polite efficiency, catching snippets of conversation as she passed. "They've arrested him. Well, it was only a matter of time. Couldn't be anyone else, could it?" At the center of it all, standing between two constables, was Arthur Briggs. Arthur was a handyman who had done odd jobs around St. Mary Mead for years. He was broad-shouldered, thick-set, and rough-looking. Marple had always thought him rather simple, though not malicious, but today his face was red with frustration. His large hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I tell you, I had nothing to do with it," he bellowed. "I don't even know the man." Inspector Fletcher stood before him, looking unimpressed. "The evidence says otherwise," Fletcher said evenly. Miss Marple approached just as Fletcher turned to the constables. "Take him inside." The moment the door of the police station closed behind Arthur Briggs, the crowd erupted into chatter. "Well, that settles it then," said Mrs. Kirby, adjusting her hat. "Arthur always had a temper, didn't he?" Miss Porter, who had been listening intently, nodded. "And he worked near Fernla Cottage last week, would have known the place well." Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She had seen many an arrest in her time, and she recognized when one was made out of convenience rather than certainty. And so she did something very bold indeed. She walked straight into the police station. Inside, Inspector Fletcher was seated at his desk, rubbing his temples, while Arthur sat with his arms crossed, looking thoroughly miserable. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, Inspector, I do hope I'm not intruding." Fletcher sighed, but gestured for her to sit. "I imagine you've come to tell me I've made a mistake." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh dear, I wouldn't dream of being so forward." She clasped her hands together. "But I am terribly curious about what evidence led you to arrest Mr. Briggs." Arthur huffed. "So am I." Fletcher shot him a glare before turning back to Miss Marple. "It's quite simple," he said. "We found Wetherall's pocket watch and Arthur's tool bag. That, along with the fact that he was seen in the area near Fernla Cottage on the night of the murder, is enough to bring him in." Miss Marple gave a small hum of consideration. "And this pocket watch," she asked, "where exactly was it found?" Fletcher's brows furrowed. "In his bag, as I said." Miss Marple nodded. "And who, might I ask, found it there?" Fletcher hesitated. "One of my constables." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Ah, and was this before or after?" Half the village had already decided that Arthur was the likely culprit. Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "Exactly." Fletcher frowned. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Only that it is rather convenient, isn't it, that Mr. Wetherall's watch, one of the only personal items missing from his body, should appear so neatly placed in the bag of a man who has no clear motive to kill him. Fletcher rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Go on. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I believe, Inspector, that Arthur Briggs is not your man at all. Rather, someone wanted very much for you to believe that he was. Arthur gaped at her. That's what I've been saying. Fletcher let out a slow breath. You think the watch was planted? Miss Marple tilted her head. Well, dear, don't you? Fletcher muttered a curse under his breath. Miss Marple gave a pleased smile. Oh, how lovely. We're in agreement. Arthur Briggs was not released immediately, but Fletcher had agreed to re-examine the evidence. As Miss Marple left the station, she felt a sense of satisfaction, but also a deepening curiosity. Someone had gone through a great deal of trouble too, framed an innocent man, and that meant the true culprit was still at large. That evening, as she sat with her knitting, Miss Marple found herself thinking once more about Wetherall's interest in the old mill. Why had he been so curious about a place no one had cared about for years? And was it possible that the answer to his murder could be found there? With a quiet nod to herself, she set aside her knitting. Tomorrow, she would take a walk to the mill, and perhaps, she was very lucky, she would find the next piece of the puzzle waiting for her there. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was fresh and crisp, the faint scent of damp earth lingering from the previous night's rain. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, had already finished her breakfast, a simple affair of buttered toast and tea, and was now preparing for a walk. But this was no ordinary stroll. Her destination was the old mill, the very place where Michael Wetherall had expressed interest before his untimely death. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay at the edge of the village, where the land sloped toward a slow-moving stream. Miss Marple had always found that places long forgotten had a habit of hiding secrets, and today she was quite determined to uncover them. The walk to the old mill took her along a narrow, overgrown path, bordered by hedgerows thick with tangled ivy. The building itself was as she remembered it, a weather-beaten structure of stone and timber. Its wooden wheel, long since broken, its roof partially caved in from neglect. The last miller had left decades ago, and since then it had been little more than a landmark, spoken of only in passing. And yet Michael Wetherall had been asking about it. Why? Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her sharp eyes scanning the exterior before stepping inside. The air was cool and stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and dust. Light filtered through the gaps in the roof, casting long beams across the floor, where remnants of broken machinery and old sacks of grain still lay untouched. She moved carefully, her small frame navigating the uneven ground with practiced ease. It was quiet, eerily so, until soft scuffling sound echoed from the far corner of the mill. Miss Marple froze. Her heart beat steady, but alert. Then, in the shadows, she saw it, a figure, not a ghost, nor some lingering spirit of the past, but a man, and he was watching her. Miss Marple's instinct was to appear unfazed. Though she gripped the handle of her handbag a little tighter, she tilted her head slightly, serving the figure as he stepped into the light. He was a man of about 40, dressed in workman's clothes, quaint, with grime on his hands and a wary expression on his face. Not a vagrant, but not quite respectable either. "Good morning, Quake," she said pleasantly. The man hesitated, shifting slightly. "You're trespassing," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh dear, I do apologize. But I was simply curious. You see, I had heard that poor Mr. Wetherall was interested in this old place before his death." The man stiffened. "I don't know anything about that." Miss Marple studied him. "Oh, I rather think you do." A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a reluctant sigh, the man ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "I suppose it doesn't matter much now," he muttered. Miss Marple gave him an encouraging nod. "It often helps to talk, dear." Another hesitation. "Then he came here looking for something," the man said. Said he was working on some land deal. Wanted to check the place out. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A land deal? The man nodded. Something about old ownership records. Said the land wasn't properly accounted for. Miss Marple's mind, WHIR, red dot. Could it be that Weatherall had uncovered something about the land itself? And if so, was that the reason he had been killed? Before Miss Marple could ask another question, the man hesitated again. There's one other thing, he said slowly. Miss Marple waited patiently. The night before he died, the man said, I saw him talking to Cyril Harper. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though inside she felt a flicker of real interest. Cyril Harper, a name she had not heard in some time. Harper had once been a well-respected businessman, but in recent years he had grown quiet and reclusive, keeping largely to himself. If he had spoken with Weatherall, then he must have known something about the land the mill stood on, and if that land was disputed, then perhaps, just perhaps, there was something worth killing for by the time Miss Marple reached Cyril Harper's home. The sun had risen high, casting a warm glow over the village. Harper lived alone, in a modest but well-kept house, tucked away near the edge of town. Miss Marple knocked lightly on the door. After a long pause, it opened just enough to reveal a pair of wary eyes. Miss Marple. Harper's voice was surprised. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Oh, I do hope I'm not disturbing you. Harper hesitated, then sighed. I suppose you'd best come in. Miss Marple followed him inside, where the sitting room was neat but sparsely furnished. She took a delicate seat on the edge of a worn armchair. Harper watched her carefully. What brings you here, Miss Marple? Miss Marple folded her hands. Oh, I was just thinking about poor Mr. Weatherall. I understand you spoke with him before he died. Harper's face paled slightly. Who told you that? Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh, I do have my little ways. A tense silence followed. Then Harper sighed, rubbing his temples. Yes, he admitted. He came to see me about the old mill land. Hey, Miss Marple waited. He said there was a missing record. Something that suggested the land had never been properly transferred when the mill closed. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. And what did you tell him? Harper hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, I told him to leave it alone. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And did he? Harper's jaw tightened. No, and now he's dead. A heavy silence settled over the room. Miss Marple knew that in that moment. She had found the reason behind the murder. The question now was who else had wanted Weatherall to leave it alone, and how far had they been willing to go to ensure that he did. Miss Marple sat in Cyril Harper's modest sitting room, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face as pleasant and unassuming as ever. Yet, beneath that gentle exterior, her mind was already arranging the puzzle pieces into place. Michael Weatherall had come to St. Mary Mead because of a land dispute, a legal irregularity concerning the old mill, a place long forgotten by most, and yet someone had not forgotten. Someone had been willing to kill to keep the past buried. Cyril Harper's warning to Weatherall, leave it alone, hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple studied him closely. There was something else he wasn't saying. And then, quite suddenly, a loud knocking rattled the door. Harper started, looking at Miss Marple with uneasy suspicion. Before rising to answer it, a young police constable stood on the doorstep, his face pale, his cap slightly askew. Mr. Harper, he said, breathless, you'd better come quick. Harper frowned. What's happened? Constable swallowed hard. Okay, it's Mrs. Tate. She's been attacked. Within minutes, Miss Marple and Cyril Harper were hurrying toward the village green, where a small crowd had already gathered outside Tate's groceria. Narrow little shop squeezed between the butcher and the post office. Miss Marple could see Inspector Fletcher standing just inside the shop, his expression grim as he spoke with a trembling Mrs. Tate sat on a wooden stool, her face pale and frightened. Miss Marple wasted no time pushing gently through the crowd. "Inspector," she greeted warmly. "I do hope I'm not intruding." Fletcher gave her a long-suffering look, but he did not tell her to leave. Instead, he sighed. "Marple, I should have known you'd turn up." Marple smiled sweetly. "One does try to stay informed." "See?" Turned to Mrs. Tate, her voice gentle but firm. "My dear, what happened?" Mrs. Tate clutched a handkerchief in trembling fingers, her breathing uneven. "I was closing the shop," she murmured, eyes darting anxiously around. "I'd just bolted the door when I heard a noise behind me." "A noise?" Miss Marple prompted. Mrs. Tate shuddered. "Footsteps, quick ones." Before I could turn, she paused, voice catching. "Something struck the side of my head. I fell, and when I looked up, there was a figure in dark clothing running out the back door." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Fletcher. "A man?" the inspector asked. Mrs. Tate hesitated. I think so. But I didn't see his face." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened. "And was anything stolen?" Mrs. Tate blinked, startled. "No, not a thing." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple glanced at Fletcher. Then, "Inspector, it seems safe to assume this was not a robbery at all." Fletcher's frown deepened. "Then, what was it?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "I believe, dear, it was a warning." As Mrs. Tate recovered, Miss Marple gently pressed for more details. Mrs. Tate hesitated, then whispered, "It's about that man who was killed." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Wetherall." Mrs. Tate nodded, lowering her voice further. "I saw him the day before he died," she admitted. "He came into the shop, asked about old records, land deeds, property ownership." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "And what did you tell him?" Mrs. Tate bit her lip. "I told him what everyone knows, that the mill was abandoned after the last owner died, and that no one had ever claimed it." She hesitated. "But I also mentioned something else, that Cyril Harper's father had been involved in the land dealings years ago." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of confirmation. The Harper family had once been tied to the old mill's ownership records, and Wetherall had been asking the wrong questions. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Someone had attacked Mrs. Tate to keep her quiet because she had unknowingly given Wetherall the final piece of information he needed, and now the killer was afraid she might do the same for the police. By the time Miss Marple left the shop, the village was buzzing with speculation. 2 crimes barely a day apart, 1 murder, and now an attack to silence a witness. And at the heart of it all, the missing land records. Miss Marple walked slowly, deep in thought. She had long known that St. Mary Mead was a place of secrets, but this was something far older. It's buried deeper. It was not just about land, it was about power, and whoever had killed Michael Wetherall had done so not out of impulse, but out of necessity, because Wetherall had been on the verge of uncovering something they could not allow to come to light, and that meant the killer was watching. They were waiting, and if Miss Marple was not careful, they would strike again. By the time she reached Honeysuckle Cottage, Miss Marple had already made up her mind. There was only one thing left to do. She would need to go straight to the source. She would need to visit the old St. Mary Mead Parish archives, because if there was a missing record, a land dispute, or a fraudulent transfer, it would be there. And Miss Marple had no intention of waiting for the police to stumble upon it themselves. She gathered her coat, secured her hat, and stepped outside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden light over the village. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Somewhere, someone was nervous, and that, in her experience, meant that they would soon make a mistake. She just had to be ready when they did. The sun was beginning to set as Miss Marple arrived at the St. Mary Mead Parish Archives, a small stone building nestled at the far end of the village. where old records, land deeds, and parish documents were carefully stored. Few people had any reason to visit the archives these days, which made it all the more interesting that Michael Wetherall had been so keen to examine them before his untimely death. And now Miss Marple intended to find out why. She stepped inside, the scent of aged paper and dust filling the air. The small wooden desks were empty, save for one figure, a thin, bespectacled man who sat hunched over a large ledger. Mr. Lawson, Miss Marple greeted pleasantly, recognizing the village archivist. Lawson looked up, blinking. Miss Marple, what a surprise. She smiled gently, removing her gloves. Oh, I do so enjoy looking through old records. It is fascinating what history can tell us. Lawson chuckled. Okay, yes, but most people prefer reading novels. Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh, but real life is far more entertaining than fiction, don't you think? Lawson merely shrugged, returning to his work. Miss Marple began searching the shelves, her fingers trailing lightly over the worn bindings of ledgers and land registries. If Wetherall had been searching for something specific, it would likely be found among the older property records. And sure enough, after some careful browsing, she found Eda yellowing ledger marked 1892 to 1905, detailing land ownership in and around St. Mary Mead. She pulled it down with care, bringing it to a nearby desk and flipping through its aged pages. Then she saw it, a transfer of ownership for the old mill and surrounding land, dated 1904. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. The name listed under the new ownership was that of Cyril Harper's father, but beneath it, a faint smudge of ink remained as though a previous name had been hastily erased. Miss Marple leaned in, her sharp eyes studying the faint traces of letters beneath the ink. Someone had altered this document, and Michael Wetherall had likely discovered the same thing just before he was murdered. Miss Marple closed the ledger carefully, pressing her gloved hands against the aged leather cover. She now had all the proof she needed. But proof alone was not enough, not for a mind as cunning and cautious as her adversaries. Whoever had killed Michael Wetherall had done so with calculated precision. They had also attacked Mrs. Tate in an effort to silence her, which meant that if Miss Marple were to flush them out, Key needed to provoke them into action. And there was only one way to do that. She would need to make them think she had found the final missing piece, even if she had not. The next morning, Miss Marple went about her usual routine, visiting the village tea shop, stopping by the grocer's, and exchanging pleasantries with the locals. But she made sure to let slip one very important detail. Oh, Inspector Fletcher was telling me the most fascinating thing yesterday, she remarked to Mrs. Hubbard over a fresh pot of tea. Mrs. Hubbard perked up immediately. Oh, what's that? Miss Marple sipped her tea with an air of casual amusement. Well, it appears the police have found something rather important in the parish archives. Mrs. Hubbard gasped. You don't say? Oh yes, Miss Marple continued. Certain document that had been altered. She smiled faintly, watching as the village gossips absorbed this information like sponges. Within an hour, the entire village would be buzzing with the news, and by evening, the real killer would have no choice but to act. Miss Marple waited patiently. In the sitting room of Honeysuckle Cottage, the fire burning low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. She had told no one what she had truly found in the archives, and yet she felt certain that before the night was through, someone would attempt to retrieve it from her. It was just a matter of waiting. Sure enough, just after midnight, she heard a soft creak outside her window, a deliberate movement in the garden. Miss Marple did not stir, but her heart quickened slightly. The door handle twisted slowly. Then a figure slipped inside. They moved cautiously, their silhouette dark against the dim glow of the firelight. And then Miss Marple spoke, her voice calm, unwavering. Oh, Mr. Harper, she murmured. I was wondering when you might come. The figure froze, Then, after a long pause, Cyril. Harper stepped fully into the light, his face tight with anger and fear. "You," he hissed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh yes, me." Harper's eyes darted to the small desk where Miss Marple had left an open ledger decoy, meant to draw him in. His fingers twitched, as if deciding whether to grab it or run. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "It's over, you know," she said kindly. "The police already know everything." Harper's jaw clenched. "You're lying." "Oh dear," Miss Marple sighed. "You sound just like poor Mr. Wetherall did before you poisoned him." Harper took a step forward, but Miss Marple remained unmoved. "You see," she continued, "Michael Wetherall realized something quite dangerous, that the ownership transfer of the old mill was forged. Your father never owned that land, did he?" Harper stiffened, but Miss Marple pressed on. "Wetherall must have uncovered the original records, showing that the land belonged to someone else, perhaps an old family, long gone. And if that came to light, why, the land would have had to be returned. You stood to lose everything." Harper breathed heavily, but still, he said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "So, you poisoned him," she said softly. "A tidy little crime, one that left no mess. And when dear Mrs. Tate mentioned your father's name, you panicked." Harper shook his head, his voice a harsh whisper. "You can't prove anything." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Okay, but I can. The real document still exists, buried in the archives where you didn't think to look." She smiled sweetly. "And Inspector Fletcher is waiting just outside." Harper's face drained of color. A moment later, the door burst open. And Inspector Fletcher and 2 constables stepped inside. Harper did not resist as they led him away. Miss Marple sighed and picked up her knitting. "Oh dear," she murmured to herself. "Such a terrible waste of a good night's sleep." As Cyril Harper was led away by Inspector Fletcher, his face pale and drawn, the small crowd that had gathered outside Honeysuckle Cottage watched in hushed astonishment. Even at this late hour, the village had sensed that something significant was happening, and as Harper was escorted into the waiting police carriage, the murmurs began to spread from her doorway. Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet satisfaction, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Though the mystery had not been entirely solved, she felt the weight of certainty settling upon her shoulders. And yet, there was one final piece missing, one last test that needed to be conducted. As the carriage rattled away into the night, Inspector Fletcher turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said at last, "I must admit, you were right about him." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, Inspector, I do try my best," Fletcher exhaled. "I only wish we had concrete evidence to charge him properly." Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "Dear, I'd rather think we will by morning." Village was quiet and still when Miss Marple finally retired to bed, though she left a lamp burning low in her sitting room. There was a certain anticipation in the air, as though the world itself knew that something was not yet finished. And sure enough, just past 1 o'clock, a soft tap sounded at her window. Miss Marple, who had been sitting up with her knitting, did not so much as flinch. Instead, she set her work aside, rose gracefully, and moved to the window. Outside, the dim glow of the street lamp, stood Miss Elspeth McGillicuddy, her nightgown wrapped tightly around her, her face pale with urgency. Miss Marple opened the door without hesitation. "Oh, my dear," she said gently, "I was rather expecting you." Miss McGillicuddy stared at her. "You were?" Miss Marple gestured her inside, guiding her to the armchair by the fire. "I imagine," Miss Marple said mildly, "that you have remembered something rather important." Miss McGillicuddy nodded, hands trembling. "I didn't think about it at the time," she whispered, "but after seeing Harper arrested tonight, it came back to me. That night, the night I heard the footsteps, I told you, I heard her cry as well, didn't I?" Miss Marple nodded, waiting. Well, Miss McGillicuddy. Swallowed, I realized something. It didn't sound like a man at all. It sounded like a woman. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, my dear, she said softly. I rather thought it might. The next morning, the village was buzzing with news of Harper's arrest. Though there was one lingering detail that had left many unsettled. If Cyril Harper had indeed killed Michael Wetherall, then why had Mrs. Tate been attacked? It was a question that troubled Miss Marple as well, for though she had no doubt that Harper was involved, she had begun to suspect that there was another hand in this affair. And so, just as the village was waking, she made her way to Tate's grocery, where Mrs. Tate was restocking the shelves. Her face still bruised from the attack, but her hands steady. Miss Marple greeted her warmly before selecting a small bag of sugar from the shelf. My dear, she said lightly, I do hope you're feeling better. Mrs. Tate offered a thin smile. Oh, Miss Marple, I suppose one must carry on, mustn't one? Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Quite so, though I do wonder, dear, if you've had any further thoughts about that night. Mrs. Tate hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, I have, actually. Miss Marple waited, letting the silence fill the space between them. Finally, Mrs. Tate exhaled. I remembered something strange, she said. Just before I was struck, I saw something out of the corner of my eyes, something red. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. A red fabric, perhaps? A coat? A scarf? Are you quite certain, dear? She asked gently. Mrs. Tate nodded firmly. It was only for a moment, but yes, it was definitely red. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, my dear, that is most helpful. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where Inspector Fletcher was reviewing the case. He looked up as she entered, sighing. Miss Marple, if you've come to tell me I've arrested the wrong man, oh no, dear, she said mildly. You've arrested one of the right men. Fletcher blinked. One of. Miss Marple settled into a chair, smoothing out her skirt. I do believe, she said, that Michael Wetherall was not murdered by a single person. Fletcher's expression darkened. Go on. Miss Marple clasped her hands. Cyril Harper, of course, had every reason to silence Wetherall. But the attack on Mrs. Tate, dear, that was rather more desperate, wasn't it? Fletcher frowned. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That our true culprit, she said, is still at large. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Inspector, do you recall a woman in St. Mary Mead who is rather fond of wearing red? Fletcher's eyes widened slightly. Then, understanding dawned. Miss Marple simply nodded. Yes, she murmured. I rather think it's time we paid Mrs. Kirby a visit. That evening, under the guise of a casual visit, Miss Marple and Inspector Fletcher arrived at Mrs. Kirby's modest home. She greeted them with the usual cheerful manner, though her eyes flickered with unease as Fletcher entered. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said lightly. I was just thinking about poor Mrs. Tate. Did you hear? She remembered something about her attacker. Mrs. Kirby stiffened. Miss Marple nodded. Double quotes. Yes. She recalled a glimpse of red, which is rather interesting, isn't it? Especially as you are the only woman in the village who regularly wears a red woolen scarf. Mrs. Kirby's face turned stark white. Fletcher stepped forward. Mrs. Kirby, where were you the night of Mrs. Tate's attack? Mrs. Kirby opened her mouth, but no words came. Then, suddenly she bolted. With a cry, she lunged for the door, but Fletcher was faster, grabbing her wrist before she could escape. Miss Marple sighed, shaking her head. Oh dear, she murmured. That was rather unwise, as Mrs. Kirby was taken into custody. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. She had been Harper's accomplice, helping to alter the land records years ago. When Wetherall came sniffing around, Harper had poisoned him, but it was Mrs. Kirby who attacked Mrs. Tate terrified that her own involvement would be exposed, and thus, with both culprits apprehended, the mystery of Michael Wetherall's murder was at last resolved as Miss Marple returned to Honeysuckle Cottage. She settled into her chair with a satisfied sigh. Crime, she reflected, was never quite as tidy as a novel, but with a little patience, a touch of cleverness, and the simple understanding of human nature, it could always be solved. The small, dimly lit interrogation room at the St. Mary Mead police station was a far cry from the warm, bustling village outside. The wooden walls, scuffed from years of use, and the single flickering lamp above the narrow table gave the room a cold, unforgiving atmosphere. It was in this room that Mrs. Kirby sat, her hands clenched together, her face pale and drawn. Gone was the cheerful village gossip, the woman who had spent years as the keeper of St. Mary Mead's secrets. Now, she was a cornered woman, and she knew it. Opposite her sat Inspector Fletcher, arms folded, his expression stern, and beside him, as calm and unassuming as ever, sat Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no anger in her eyes, no gloating, only a quiet patience as though she were watching a flower unfurl in slow motion. It was Mrs. Kirby who finally broke the silence. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple simply tilted her head slightly. "Oh, my dear," she said softly, "but you did." Mrs. Kirby's breath hitched, her fingers tightening in her lap. "You were rather clever," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle yet unwavering. "Clever enough to make sure poor Mr. Murder looked like a mystery rather than what it truly was." Fletcher leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Mrs. Kirby. "We know you attacked Mrs. Tate to silence her, and we know you were in on the land fraud with Cyril Harper. What we don't know is why kill Wetherall." Mrs. Kirby's eyes darted between them, searching for a way out. Miss Marple sighed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, my dear," she said again, "you must understand the truth always comes out in the end." And in the stillness of that cold little room, something inside Mrs. Kirby broke. Her shoulders slumped, her fingers twitching slightly. She swallowed hard, then finally spoke. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Tell us, dear," she said. Kia said everything. Mrs. Kirby exhaled shakily, her eyes glassy as she stared down at her trembling hands. "It started years ago," she murmured, "back when my husband was still alive." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, but she said nothing. Mrs. Kirby continued. "He used to work for Cyril Harper's father. He handled the paperwork for the land ownership transfer when the mill shut down." Fletcher's brows knitted together. "You mean the forged documents?" Mrs. Kirby nodded weakly. "I didn't know it was illegal at first," she whispered. "Harper's father promised my husband that it was just a correction in a record something harmless. But then I found out the truth." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, patient. "And what truth was that, dear?" Mrs. Kirby swallowed. "That the land wasn't supposed to be Harper's at all. It belonged to another family years ago, but Harper's father paid off officials to make it disappear." Fletcher let out a slow breath, glancing at Miss Marple. "That's what Wetherall found, isn't it?" Mrs. Kirby nodded. "He came to me," she whispered, "just a few days before he was killed. Said he had proof that the land transfer was fake. He said he's going to expose everything." She gave a shaky laugh, pressing her fingers to her lips. "I panicked. I thought he went to the authorities. They'd find out about my husband's involvement, too. They'd dig up the past, and my family would be ruined." Fletcher's voice was grim. "So you killed him?" Mrs. Kirby's head snapped up, eyes wide. No, I swear, I didn't mean to." Miss Marple watched her carefully, waiting. Mrs. Kirby's voice dropped to a whisper. "I just meant to scare him, so." She took a shaky breath, staring down at the table. I met him in the woods that night, she admitted. Told him to drop the investigation, but he wouldn't listen. Fletcher's jaw clenched. So, you poisoned him? Mrs. Kirby nodded, tears brimming. I had a vial of arsenicide, used it on rats before. Thought, if I could just make him sick, give him a scare, maybe he'd leave St. Mary Mead before things got out of hand. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes softened just slightly. But, dear, she said gently, you must have known that arsenic is unpredictable. Mrs. Kirby let out a shuddering breath. I thought I gave him just enough to make him ill, she whispered. I never meant for it to. She cut herself off, pressing her hands to her face. A long silence filled the room. Then, last, Miss Marple spoke. My dear, she said softly, poison is not a weapon of impulse. It requires thought, planning, and preparation. Even if you never intended for it to kill him, you still chose to use it. Mrs. Kirby let out a soft sob, nodding. Yes, she whispered. I did. Fletcher turned to Miss Marple, his expression unreadable. You knew, didn't you? He asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh dear, I wouldn't say I knew, she murmured, but I suspected. She turned back to Mrs. Kirby, her eyes kind yet firm. The attack on Mrs. Tate confirmed it, she said. It was clumsy, desperate, not the action of a calculated murderer, okay, but of someone who was panicked, afraid that their secret was about to be exposed. Fletcher exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Well, he muttered, at least we have our confession. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing out her skirt. Well, my dear, she said to Mrs. Kirby, I do hope you'll find some peace of mind in finally telling the truth. Mrs. Kirby gave a weak, trembling nod, and with that, Miss Marple turned and left the room, stepping out into the morning sunlight, where the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead awaited her once more. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat once again by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she reflected on the case now resolved. She had long believed that crime was never about to act itself, but rather about human nature. People killed for greed, for fear, for love, and for secrets buried in the past, and in the end, it was never truly about the land, nor the documents, nor even Weatherall himself. It had been about fear, the fear of losing everything. Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile as she finished a neat row of stitches. Fear, after all, was the oldest motive in the world. The quiet hum of St. Mary Mead resumed its usual rhythm in the days following Mrs. Kirby's confession. The village, ever fond of its routines, wasted no time in settling back into its comfortable gossip and daily affairs, though the murder of Michael Weatherall had left an undeniable mark. There was an unspoken agreement among the villagers to move forward as people always did. Even after the most shocking events, Miss Marple had seen it happen many times before. For all the suspicion, excitement, and whispered theories, the people of St. Mary Mead were remarkably resilient, perhaps because deep down we understood that secrets never stay buried forever. It was on a particularly mild morning that Miss Marple found herself once again at the police station, where Inspector Fletcher sat behind his desk. Going through the last of the case reports, he looked up as she entered, letting out a long-suffering sigh. Miss Marple, he said, I should have known you'd come. She smiled pleasantly, taking a seat across from him. Okay, Inspector, I do hate to trouble you, she said, folding her hands neatly, but I was just wondering, how is Mrs. Kirby? Fletcher exhaled. Let's confess to everything, he admitted. She'll be charged with manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, since it's clear she didn't intend to kill Weatherall. Miss Marple nodded. Ah, yes, intent does make all the difference, doesn't it? Fletcher studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. You really had it all figured out before I did, didn't you? He asked. Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. Oh, not at all, dear. I only noticed a few things that seemed off. Fletcher chuckled. That's putting it mildly. He paused, then added, more seriously, you know, I still don't quite understand how you saw it before I did. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, my dear Inspector, she said, people are very much the same, no matter where you find them. The trick is simply knowing what to look for. By the following week, the village had moved on at the Red Lion tea shop. Miss Marple sat at her favorite table, stirring a lump of sugar into her tea. Across from her, Miss McGillicuddy was still shaking her head in disbelief. I can hardly believe it, she murmured. Mrs. Kirby. And to think, all this time she was hiding such a dreadful secret. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Oh, secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, dear, she said lightly. Much like water through old stone. It may take years, but eventually the truth finds its way out. Miss McGillicuddy shuddered. Huh, I must say, I'll be sleeping a lot easier now that the whole thing is over. Miss Marple smiled knowingly. Yes, she murmured, as will I. With that, she returned to her knitting, while the whirl of St. Mary mead carried on as it always had, with tea, gossip, and a deep appreciation for a well-solved mystery.